starting things off with a story of a haunted hotel room, and moving into stories of camping trips, premonitions, and much more. Tonight's lineup is one to remember. A huge thank you to all of tonight's writers. Remember to send in your story if you'd like to have it featured. You can either submit it at my subreddit r/slumberreads, or my email you can find in the description. Be sure to drop a like if you enjoy. Subscribing if you're new is also very much appreciated. Enjoy the video, and as always, I hope you all have a great night. I think it goes without saying that I was not pleased when I heard our branch was being downsized. As it turns out, despite my doubts, I was a transfer to the Manchester branch person, and not a severance package person. I figured it would be a difficult transition, but I had no idea. Money was tight, so it wasn't as though I could just immediately get an apartment in Manchester. I thought it best to sleep in a hotel for a week or two. After some searching, I landed on the Jackson Hotel, a quaint little place. It was cheap, but appeared neatly kept on their website, and it was no more than 5 minutes drive from my new workplace. At first, it all seemed a bit too good to be true. I pulled up to the hotel and squeezed my car in the tight parking lot, immediately adjacent to the sweet little building. The hotel was situated on a log suburban road between shoddy office buildings and shops, most of which had different, equally vomit-inducing puns for names. In particular, I remember a koi, rarely visited fish and chips shop named the Codfather. I pulled my luggage out the boot and hauled it through the 2 squeaking doors around the front of the place. My nose was immediately met with a noticeably musty odor as I entered. From scent alone, you could tell this place didn't get too many visitors. Before me was a small lobby. Old furniture had been dotted around the walls, which were plastered with a vile, cream wallpaper, strands of which were drooping down from where it met the roof. At that point, it was evident that the pictures on the website were deceiving. They must have been taken 20 or so years ago. The place was old, so old the walls were trembling under the weight of themselves. After surveying the entrance, I approached the old woman behind the front desk. She sat there, brooding, absently sipping on a petite china cup filled to the top with tea, which dripped like tears down the side. A name tag reading Mary hung loosely on her worn red sweater. She looked nice enough, but after trying to get my room key from her, it was clear her heart wasn't in it anymore. I don't blame her. She replied to my request with a series of grunts and hushed tones mixed in with the occasional clearing of her throat. I could take a hint. After getting my room key, I didn't bother her with any more chatter, and instead made my way down the long hallway she had indicated to. The faint sight of a figure became clearer as I neared my room. An older man pushing a cart stuffed with cleaning supplies. He stopped in front of room 18 and began scrubbing the filthy white door. I could see as I pushed my key through the rusted keyhole. He jerked his head upwards. He chuckled, still facing the door he was cleaning. I ignored him and unlocked my room. Just as I was about to step inside, he stopped his raspy chuckling and addressed me directly. "Are you sure about that, lad?" I turned. "Pardon?" I said, confused, trying to seem as undisturbed as possible. 17? He chuckled. "My room number." "I'm sorry, who are you?" I asked, desperate for the man to stop being so cryptic. The man stood straight and looked at me. Or well, at first glance it might appear that way, but there was something off about his gaze. It almost appeared as though he was looking just past my eye line and into the open room. "Eddie," he croaked, pointing at his name tag. "Been cleaning this place for years. Seen a lot of people come in and out, and..." He stopped abruptly and turned his gaze to the floor. A sly smirk crept across his wrinkled face. 17. He began chuckling again as he turned and resumed his cleaning. I was thoroughly creeped out. Finally, I entered the room and pushed the door closed behind me. To my surprise, the musty smell of the hallway was gone. Instead, my nose was met with a warm, flowery scent, and it didn't appear to be as unkempt as the rest of the place. Up until that point, the Jackson Hotel had not given me the best first impression, so you can imagine my astonishment when my room was in such, dare I say, pleasant condition. The carpet was a fluffy light red, which contrasted beautifully with the almost milky white walls. Pushed up against the wall was a large king bed. The black sheets had been pulled over it perfectly. Before I even unpacked, I lay on the bed over top the quilt like a child. My head sank into the pillows. The slight elevation the pillows gave me allowed me to see the rest of the room before me. A small, carpeted gap separated a large, modern television from the wooden decor of the bed, and to the right of that, beside an unblemished window, facing me as I lay there, was a heavy-looking brown door. I climbed out of the bed and pulled it open by its curved metal handle. Behind was a blue-tinted bathroom, floored with white tiles and walls painted with the color of the sea. It was strangely long for a bathroom, I noted. Huge gaps were between the scarcely placed facilities, and at the end of the hallway-like room, a large bathtub rusted at the seams. A creamy, opaque shower curtain hung scrunched up at the bottom and hid the vague silhouette of a tap behind it. There was an uneasiness about it. I shut the door. Work had given me a few days off to settle into the city before the merger, so I spent the rest of that day exploring the city. I wandered aimlessly down those bustling streets until the sky turned orange as the sun dipped over the rows of old houses and shops. Before it turned dark, I returned to the hotel. Once again, I passed Mary, still ruminating behind her worn desk, cup of tea in hand. Thankfully, I didn't come across Eddie the cleaning man on my long trip down the hallway. The unnerving aroma he gave off was all too cliché for me. Growing weary, I found myself once again sinking into the bed of room 17, lying on my side, tucked under the covers. I closed my eyes and sighed. The room was nice, but I wasn't too sure about the place in general, or the people for that matter. It doesn't matter all that much though, I thought. I found peace in the idea that I'd be out of there soon enough, if nothing else. I figured sleep was one of the few luxuries I could afford, and I sure as hell wasn't gonna let some creepy old hotel take that from me. And eventually I did. Fall asleep, I mean. It took a few tosses and turns, but eventually I nodded off, the floor of the room above me creaking and churning all the while. But just as I slipped past the thin veil of sleep, above the groans and rasps of the old building, I could have sworn I heard the slow, muffled whimpering of a baby. My first day at the Jackson Hotel was admittedly uneventful, but looking back, I think it may have been the most significant. That was the day my fate was sealed. The day I was chosen by whatever lurked in that accursed room. By the time I woke up the following morning, I was ready for another day of exploring the city. I threw on my shoes and outdoor clothes and exited my room into the muck and grime of that unkempt hallway, which seemed to twist and turn the longer I stared down its vacant length. Well, it wasn't completely vacant. Behind me, I just about heard the scrubbing of stale flannels against parched wood. I turned. There he was again. Eddie, the cleaning man. I was almost mesmerized by the monotony of his technique. All he did was drag the flannel in a perfect circle around the door. Peculiar, I thought. But before I could look away, he turned his head to the side to face me, giving me a knowing nod. I shot one back as to not be rude, before I turned and went on my way. Once again, I walked the squalid streets of Manchester beneath a grey sky, but that day the avenues of the city felt lonelier than they had the day before. Don't be mistaken though, there was no shortage of people, not by any means. Just as they had been the previous day, legions of miserable pedestrians marched down the streets, as if on their way to a funeral. That was nothing new, but what was new, however, was the air of dread that loomed over the fifth-ridden roads. Damp vapors of mist and cloud had sunk to the concrete, and in the spaces between the wandering citizens, a chilled breeze swept through, whispering. During my inane walk, I passed by a restaurant. Its windows were surprisingly well kept. They looked as though they were polished down to every grain of sand. I stared through them. A few couples sat, chewing monotonously on whatever three-course disappointment they had been served, but otherwise the place was empty. As I stared through the smooth glass, I began to notice my half-hunched reflection. I moved closer to it. My brows were in a perpetual frown, which I otherwise would not have realized, and my head was tilted slightly downwards, as if it were weighing on my neck. I squinted and peered closer, looking back into my sunken eyes, ringed in black and bloodshot. I continued to ogle, confused at my own reflection. Besides, I felt very well rested when I woke up that morning. Maybe I didn't sleep as well as I thought. I had enough of the outdoors. I turned back the way I came and trudged toward to the hotel. Mesmerized by the satisfying crunch of autumn leaves underfoot, my head snapped down as I felt my foot sinking into a pile of dog crap hidden between the leaves. I stumbled back to the old hotel a few blocks away, my shoeless right foot throbbing as I went. The foul stench of the shoe I was now holding attacked my nostrils while I shambled into the lobby. I pushed through the toilet doors opposite to Mary's desk, where she still sat, barely looking up from her tea as I did. I wrapped a strand of toilet paper around my hand and began scrubbing the filth-covered boot below a running tap. Over the sounds of scrubbing and trickling water, I heard the door creak open. Eddie shambled through it, spray and cloth in hand. I looked back down and continued to scrub, but I couldn't help but notice, in the rim of my peripheral, his hunched frame facing me. "Too scared to do that in your own room?" He inquired judiciously, almost whispering in his harsh, gruff voice. "Excuse me?" I looked up. My shoe now completely cleaned. I slipped it on, ignoring the water that seeped into my sock. I wanted to leave as soon as I could. "Sorry for my prodding, but I couldn't help but wonder why you're in here, and not in your room is all." I looked at him puzzlingly. "Why did you ask if I was scared?" I didn't expect a clear answer from the man, but I just had to ask. He looked down as I asked him, and began cleaning a stall door. "Well, it's an old hotel, even older than me." He chuckled. "Been lots of guests over the years. Who knows, perhaps some of them never left." I didn't say anything. Instead, I just stared at him, trying to figure out whether he was joking or not. In my silence, he turned to look at me as well. He smirked. "Not the loquacious type, huh? Loosen up, kid. I'm just pulling your leg." Figured as much. Not saying so much as goodbye, I left. Back in my room, I slipped under the covers and turned the TV on. I could see through the window. It was only just turning dark, but for whatever reason, my eyelids felt heavy and my head felt dazed. Like when you wake up from a nap and your mouth is dry and funny tasting, and all you want to do is go back to sleep. I turned in my bed and reached for the TV remote laying on my nightstand. But as I did, over the sound of the blaring television, I heard something. It was sharp and sudden, yet I just barely heard it. I snatched the remote up and cranked the volume down to 0 as I sat up in the bed. I wanted to see if it would happen again. Suddenly the silence was broken by the same sound. A brief, strident cracking sound, like the sound of someone snapping a chicken bone, directly on the left side of the bed. Unmoving, I stared at the empty carpet beside where I lay before I heard it again. This time from the opposite side of the room. My eyes darted to the side of my bed. It sounded low to the ground, as if whatever was making the sound was lying down or crawling maybe. It was an intensely guttural noise which smacked off the walls each time. Thinking it was over, I slumped back down in the bed. Try as I might, I couldn't quite rationalize it. My room was on the ground floor, so it wasn't as though it was coming from a room below mine. Perhaps there was a basement I wasn't aware of. That was it, I figured. Just some maintenance in a basement. The room remained quiet as I slowly fell asleep. My dry eyes snapped open as if a loud crash had woken me. I pushed backwards and sat up in the bed as cold droplets of sweat trickled from my brow. There was an uneasiness about the room. I peered over to the window. It was still dark outside. I couldn't have slept for long. Nothing but the pale moon and a flickering lamppost lit the squalid streets outside. My gaze was so absorbed by the view of the blackened window that it took me a few moments to notice the bathroom door, halfway open, and from behind it, I could thinly make out the muffled sound of a woman sobbing. Unhurriedly, I climbed out of bed. The soft, crimson carpet tickled my bare feet as I crept toward the door. As I approached, the sobbing slowly turned to anguished cries. I placed my trembling hand on the door, and I could feel the woman's wailing blowing against the wood. I pushed it open. Silence fell in the room, but the absence of noise somehow made it worse. The heavy door creaked open to reveal what lurked behind it. The same white room. Polished tiles and walls the color of the sea sprawled across the stretched room. I nearly missed it at first glance. I squinted and turned my gaze to the end of the hallway-like bathroom where the tub sat. The opaque shower curtain pulled halfway to the end, and beyond the thin, white plastic, I could barely make out the vague silhouette of a woman, laying silently in the tub. "Hello?" I whimpered. "I think you have the wrong room." My voice sounded ill and stupid in my ears as I spoke. My words lingered in the room for a moment. Suddenly, the sound of disturbed water and dripping filled the room as the woman climbed to her feet behind the curtain. I tried to squeeze out something else, but my jaw was almost paralyzed by the absolute terror I felt as a wet, skinny hand pulled the curtain back. The woman's wicked details were now clear. She stepped out of the bath. Her feet smacked the tiled floor as she did. Her face was blue and sunken. Loose, damp strands of skin hung off her long neck. Her haunting figure lurked towards me. She was completely unclothed. Her tall body was slender, gaunt to the point of emaciation. Her dripping skin pulled tightly over her bones. Her eyes were pushed back deep into their sockets. Her complexion the hollow cry of death. Clumps of black hair drooped over her naked shoulders like seaweed. What lips she had were purple and bloated. Water dripped from her gaping mouth. She had the expression of terror. Her jaw hung low, as if she were screaming, but the only sounds to leave her mouth were deep gargles over a thin, accursed moan. I turned and bolted for the door as she shambled nearer and nearer to me. My hand clutched the door handle, but try as I might, it wouldn't budge. I slammed and screamed against the wood as the wet slaps of feet against tiles behind me turned to the rustling of carpet. "Help!" I cried more times than I care to remember, and over my anguished wails a cracking, snapping sound began to start up again. Just as I felt cold breath on the back of my neck, the door finally swung open and I tumbled out of the room, kicking the door shut behind me as I caught one last glimpse of the dead woman far too close to the door. But that wasn't all. As the door slammed shut, I saw something else. Behind the shambling ghoul, a smaller figure flailed in the corner. It didn't look dissimilar from a baby. I clawed against the hallway walls and climbed to my feet before I sprinted down the twisting hall. I was so caught up in adrenaline that, as I reached the end, I didn't notice the plastic carts of cleaning supplies being pushed around the corner into the lobby. I crashed into it, falling to the ground amidst a wave of sprays and cloth. "What are you doing, boy?" A familiar croaky voice shouted. "Eddie." I shot to my feet, panting, pointing down the empty hallway. "A woman," I whimpered. Eddie looked at me, a puzzled expression on his face, before turning to follow my finger down the hallway. "There's nothing there, boy. I've just been down there." No, I protested. "In my room. There was a woman in my room." He continued to ogle at me, confused. Then I remembered our conversation on the toilet. "Who the hell is she?" "I know you know," I shouted, still out of breath. His expression changed as I said it. "You owe me that much after what I just saw." Eddie looked down as if disappointed in himself. "Yeah, suppose you're right," he said. He leaned against the wall and began. "It's rather a sad tale, really. See, years ago, before even I worked here, there lived a girl. Young and innocent she was. Used to live right down the road, in fact. Lucy was her name. As girls her age often do, she took interest in a boy, a handsome young chap. Eventually, to her delight, Lucy and his boy started to hit it off, so they say. But the boy's intentions did not exactly align with hers, unfortunately. So, as you can imagine, one thing led to another, and one day, Lucy woke up pregnant. This didn't exactly sit well with her family. Her father, the mean, neglectful man he was, kicked her and her newborn out of the house after the birth. In her desperation, she turned once again to the boy who had knocked her up, but he was not willing to help either. She finally managed to scrounge up enough money to stay here for a few days. In your room, number 17. Once in the room, figuring herself not capable of caring for the boy, snapped the child's neck beside the bed before drowning herself in the bath. After a few days, residents started reporting an awful smell coming from 17. Some unfortunate staff member found the two bodies and called the police, who promptly moved them out. Now residents report seeing a specter in the room with them. Some even run out in the middle of the night. Like you. As if I even needed to say it. I didn't return to room 17 that night. I thanked Eddie and called a coworker asking if I could stay at his for the night. He let me, God bless him. Once at his house, he fixed me up with some outdoor clothes so I could go back for my things in the morning. It wasn't easy returning to that hotel, much less that room. I tried looking for Eddie to go in with me in the morning. Juvenile, I know, but I think my reasoning is logical. Couldn't find him though. So in the warm light of the next day, I entered the accused room alone once again. Luckily for me, my repacking went without incident. I think the spirit probably figured she had exhausted all my terror the previous night. I hauled my clumsily packed luggage to the front desk to check out. Just as before, Mary sat solemnly behind the desk. When I told her I was checking out, she scoffed. "You booked a week," she said. "I'd still like to check out, please," I confirmed. An expression of brash realization crossed her face. "Saw him, did ya?" She smirked. I was confused. "Who?" I inquired. "Oh, well, lots of guests who stay in the room 17 say they see the ghost of a man swinging by a noose at the foot of the bed. The hangman, we call him." "No," I croaked. "I was told that a girl haunts that room. Lucy. She drowned herself in the bathtub, apparently." I responded, puzzled. "Is that who you saw?" Mary asked. I nodded, frightened for what she might say next. She looked down. "Well, that is new," she said, surprised. "A girl called Lucy did die in that room, but no one reports seeing her. Everyone who stays in that room says they saw the man who killed her. Story goes that the girl killed her baby, as she knew deep down she couldn't care for him. Then, later that same day, the father came to the room to check on her and the child. After seeing the boy's dead body, he killed the girl in a blind rage. Drowned her in the bath before hanging himself out of guilt at the foot of the bed. Eddie, his name was." I couldn't tell you how fast my heart raced after those words left her mouth. Once at a safe distance away from the wretched place, I rang my mother. After a long negotiation, she agreed to lend me some money for an apartment in the city, and you can be damn sure I checked the place wasn't haunted before moving in. It wasn't. I could finally settle down, I thought. But true stories seldom have such conclusive endings. I think my story by itself is interesting enough to share without the need of a moral or a lesson. I suppose if you really want to attach a message to the story, I imagine it would be, never go in room 17 at the Jackson Hotel. But if that was all it was, if that's all my story means, then I would probably just leave it as an anecdote, an icebreaker. A bad story to make me interesting at parties. The reason I'm telling this story, the real reason, is because that night, just as I was on the verge of sleep, I heard something. A sound. Not a cracking sound though, nor the sobbing of a woman, but instead the slow, monotonous swinging of a rope at the foot of my bed. My story happened late last year, maybe around August of 2019. I went on a remote beach camping trip with my family. This means you go far out down a trail for miles and camp on a little private section of beach, mostly by yourself. Me, my aunt, my mom, my sister, and her friend were all on this trip. To get to our campsite, we had to pack everything we would need for the weekend into our backpacks, including food, water, and tents, and carry them all the way up to our campsite. The walk to the campsite was 8 miles. In the heat and the blaring sunlight, we had gotten a late start, so we really needed to get there before dark. The walk was miserable, and we definitely overpacked, as the bags were very heavy. A few miles in, and I was beginning to think it wasn't worth it, and begging for us to turn around and just go home. We finally arrive at our campsite hours later, completely exhausted. Our campsite is behind a row of big sand dunes that line the edge of a private beach, reserved for people like us who want to camp all the way out here. The path winds from a crack in the sand dunes all the way down to our campsite. There are thin trees with overhanging branches that provide us shade and a picnic table for us to sit at. We set up our tents in the small space between the picnic table and the bushes and trees that line our campsite. Even setting up the tent was exhausting, but as soon as the tents were up, I immediately went inside to lay down. Everything is humid and sticky with sand already everywhere. It's even hotter in the tent. The air is so still and suffocating, but it was the only place we could properly lie down and rest. I'm already regretting agreeing to go, but there's no way I can walk 8 miles back, so I'm stuck here with no cell service and no one around for miles. At least we finally made it to the campsite. Definitely the hardest thing I've physically had to do. But that's not the point of the story. Rain drizzles from the sky, thick and wet, but does nothing to stop the heat. The rain just traps us in our tents in the stifling heat for a few hours, and during this time, I take a nap. After waking up from my nap, I notice the rain has come and went, and it's getting dark out. When I step out of the tent, I see a man coming up the path by himself and set up his tent in the campsite across from ours. Keep in mind, it's a really remote stretch of beach, 8 miles or more from any other humans. And this guy sets up camp as close as he could to us. The whole time he was setting up camp and exploring the area in the dusk light, he repeatedly walked by our campsite, and it's like he slowed down and watched us. If we looked over into his campsite, it's like he was already staring back at us. We try to push him from our minds, and as it's dark, raining once again, and there's nothing else to do, we climbed into our tents and got ready to sleep. A lantern was kept on outside on a picnic table, and as I lay there trying to sleep, I could see large shadows moving in front of the light and casting on my tent. At first, they looked like maybe moths or some sort of bug just flying around the lantern. But then it's like the shadows got bigger and moved slowly across my tent. Everyone was already in their tents, so it was no one at my campsite, and I wasn't sure what else it could be. The shadows slowly went away, and I forgot all about it. Time passed, and my mom eventually went out and turned the lantern off. Everything was quiet for a while. Then I heard twigs snapping and bushes moving all around me like footsteps walking around the outside of the campsite. They paced around and around like they were slowly circling the camp. If I moved around my tent too much or picked up a flashlight, I couldn't hear the footsteps anymore. They would stop abruptly. Once I lay back down in my sleeping bag and cut the light off, they would continue again, getting closer and closer every time. It was pitch black at that time, and while I could hear raindrops rolling down the tent, I almost felt like I could hear someone's fingers sliding along the tent as well. Then I saw the fingers pressing into the tent slightly and sliding their way around the tent. Around and around they went. I was paralyzed with fear, a teardrop rolling down my cheek. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. I just kept watching the fingers around and around my tent. I'm not sure how I managed to fall asleep again, but one minute it's dark outside, and I hear someone outside my tent slowly pulling on the zipper, and the next minute I'm waking up. It takes me a minute to realize I'm not in my tent. I feel hard-packed sand underneath me, and the heat of the bright sunlight feels hot on my body. I squint my eyes and look around, determining I'm not even at my campsite anymore. I struggle to my feet, groaning in pain. I look down at my body. My clothes are ripped to shreds, barely hanging onto my body. My whole body's sore inside and out, deep cuts crisscrossing my legs and stomach. Some sort of symbol is etched right below my belly button. I stumble barefoot, tears now rolling down my face as I try to find my campsite. I look across through some trees, and that's when it hits me. I'm at the guy's campsite. The guy who camped next to us. Except all of his stuff is gone. I'm the only one here. Not a trace he ever existed, and I can't remember a thing. I get to my campsite and my whole family rushes to me, hugging me and asking me what happened. They were so worried when they woke up this morning, not just because I wasn't there. I look past them to my tent. The whole thing ripped to shreds, and in the sand written in my blood, "Sleep tight." Collapse on the ground. Too tired to even stand anymore. I'm covered in blood and scared out of my mind. My sister confesses that she thought she heard someone last night, but thought she was just imagining it. A ranger came by 2 days later. By then, I was comatose and don't remember being taken out of there. My scars healed and my family moved on. But I wake up screaming from nightmares if I even dare to sleep. I can remember everything he did to me when I sleep, even if I can't remember it in the morning. I've woken up to me clawing at my eyes, just to stop seeing him. I lock every window and door in my house, but I swear on nights I can't sleep, I hear him. His knife tapping softly on the window, him turning the doorknob just to see if it's unlocked. One day, I'm afraid I'll get careless, and next time, you won't let me go so easily. Hello all, my name is Henry and recently I moved back home after my college semester had ended. I was fortunate enough to be able to move back home with my parents and enjoy the summer, but the past couple of days have been particularly difficult for me and my family. I'll start from the beginning, from the first one I can remember having. My first premonition started when I went to the fishing pond by myself early one morning. I couldn't wait to get there early, get a line in the water, and wrestle up a nice channel catfish. Something I've been dreaming of all winter. I got to the pond, set my pole up, and took shelter in a nice spot of shade with my line out in the depths of the pond. A tall pine tree towered over me, leaving me tucked away in a nice little spot with the sun peering through the branches. The sun burned hot that morning, and already I could feel the sweat beading on my forehead. I sat there quietly for some time, listening to the trees rustle from the slight wind, the occasional fish leaping from the water with a distinct splash, and the deep ribbon of bullfrogs wading in the marsh beyond the pond. As I gazed upon the sparkling water of the pond, the sun reflecting every ripple, every tiny disturbance on the water, the first premonition hit. It was like I was teleported into a different reality. I watched my backyard like I was in a third-person perspective, watching down at my dog playing along the edge of our backyard by the woods alone. Something wasn't right. I could feel in somewhere inside me tucked away like a deep cavernous pit. I continued watching my dog Lucky sniff the rock wall that separates our yard in a thick section of woods. Lucky snapped his head up as rustling began coming from within the woods. Soon, the hairs on Lucky's nape were standing up and he let out a thick guttural growl. A pack of 5 or 6 coyotes jumped over the rock wall, making their whiny sounds towards Lucky. Lucky stood ground while I begged for him to run. They stood facing each other like a western standoff, the coyotes making tiny steps closer and closer to him. The coyotes, mangy with patchy gray and dark hairs, bared their teeth, with wet beads of drool dripping from their mouths. I looked on in horror as they lunged at him, each of them taking bites and tears from him before he lay side down in a pool of his own blood, while the wild animals feasted. As I watched, the dreadful feeling skyrocketed, feeling my stomach sinking. I was snapped back into my own reality with my fishing line racing off of the reel. Like a second nature, I set the hook and began reeling in the fish. My mind not completely off what had just happened. I felt numb. Strange as when I hook into a fish, I get a bit of an adrenaline rush. I got the fish safely off the hook and back in the water rather quickly. I was focused on something else. It took some time, staring back into the glistening water, thinking about my dog. When I couldn't calm myself down, I called my dad and asked him if Lucky was okay. Dad told me that Lucky was out back doing his business. I yelled over the phone and begged my dad to get him inside. I guess my frantic cries and pleas left my dad without much conviction. Dad called Lucky in while still on the phone with me. What he told me next sent that same dreadful feeling deep within me. He described me as a pack of some kind of wild animals, some kind of dogs jumping out of the woods coming towards the house. Coyotes, I told him deadpan. He asked how I knew that. Lucky was barking in the background, I presumed at them. I told Dad to keep Lucky inside and don't let him out by himself. I hung up the phone and felt slightly better. My heart was still racing and I noticed my hand was trembling trying to hold my fishing pole. I didn't have much luck fishing that day. My mind was somewhere else. I was happy just to be out on the water, taking in the fresh summer air. I couldn't shake that dreadful feeling. I sat by the water's edge for some time, going over the premonition. I felt my heart start racing each time the sun reflected brightly off the water. My head began to hurt sometime after. I packed up my gear and headed home. As I pulled into my driveway, still feeling that numbing sensation in my body, I looked out towards the woods where Lucky and my premonition got attacked. I focused hard and saw through the tree line. They were waiting. I could see the rises and fall of their body with each breath they were taking. That mangy, dark and gray coat of fur and needle-sharp teeth as the pack of coyotes waited in the cover of the woods. I headed inside, greeted my Lucky and my dad, not sure if I should tell him what happened at the pond. Looking back, I wish the rest of the premonitions were as simple as this one. I don't know what to call it, fate or a warning. I just wish I was able to stop the rest of them. This story is 100% true, and I wish I knew if it's linked to a movie or something. So when I was very little, I would have these dreams, well, nightmares about this lake. It was a very eerie lake with a wooden dock that would creak when someone would walk on it. I remember walking up to the dock and seeing families swimming, children of all ages splashing in the waves, mothers and fathers relaxing in the cool water, all having fun. That's how all the nightmares would begin. Then all of a sudden, in a blink of an eye, they're gone. All were dragged down beneath the dark water, and I would wake up, scared and shaking in fear. These nightmares would happen every so often as I grew up. Sometimes, the dock would change its appearance. Some nights it would be 2 pillars at the end of it, with a beam that has black cloth swaying in the wind. The other nights, it would look like a jungle gym from a school playground, but it had these weird levers with severed heads and bones. What a nice thing to dream about as a little kid, right? In this dream, I remember being on the bus sitting by a friend. Let's call him D. D and I were sitting in the back of the bus just chatting. Then we went past the lake and I froze. He looked at me and asked me what's wrong. I just pointed at the lake and said, I had a dream about that lake. The one weird thing about this dream was that the outer areas were white, just pure white. I never had a dream like that before or ever again. These dreams lasted till I was about 10 or 11. I don't really remember. But when they stopped, I was happy. They scared the hell out of me. Then around 2014, I told my cousin, let's call her C. C listened to me as I told her about these dreams. We tried finding out if it was linked to a movie or something. She had this magazine that had an ad about this movie called The Lake. We looked into it, but it wasn't linked to my dream. I also asked my family about it and they didn't know if it was linked to a movie. So after that, I stopped thinking about it. At times I would think about it and still wonder. I have a theory about this, that there's a monster living in the lake and it would drag down its victims. I fear that one night when I fall asleep, I will wake up and be on that dock. And I would walk into the cold water and wait for that monster to drag me into the cold depths below. I could imagine its slimy tentacles wrap itself around my ankle. And I would be plunged into the dark waters, having the icy cold water piece my pale skin and have it fill my lungs. I hope that day will never happen, but I still want to know what happened to those people. What dragged them down in the dark water? Why did I have those dreams and never have them again? These questions still ponder in my mind to this day. I'm 18 years old now. I haven't had those nightmares in about 8 or 9 years now. What really does lurk in the lakes, rivers, and oceans? I hope I can figure out what those nightmares meant. If you have a dream about a lake with an eerie dock, never go into the water. Run. Run as fast as you can and try to wake up. No one comes out of that lake. I've kept something to myself nearly my entire life. As a child, I had a very unique friend. My only friend at that time, to be honest. I was 8 years old and was having a tough time getting to sleep one night. I was tossing and turning in aggravation at my inability to relax. My bedroom was on the second story of the house with my parents' bedroom directly below me. I knew I had to keep my irritated flailing to a minimum, or my dad would wake up followed by a slap on my behind. My father wasn't a mean person, just stern. Directly outside my window was a large tree. Every so often, one branch would grow long enough to reach my window and would scrape against it. This may seem a little strange, but I always found the sound oddly relaxing, so it never bothered me much. However, every so often I would open my window to trim it a bit, before it does any real damage to the window. While I was usually never bothered by the sound, tonight was the exception as the scraping was becoming more and more irritating. My eyes shot open as I came to the realization that I had just trimmed that branch a couple days ago. There was no way it could have grown the length it needed to reach my window. I slowly looked over to my window, following the trail of moonlight that streamed through it. What I saw was not a tree. Something. Someone was watching me from just outside my window. I sat straight up in shock at the sudden sight. What appeared in front of me was a human form, but not human. Its dark gray skin was shriveled and dry. Its skinny limbs were reminiscent of a victim of starvation. One of its bony hands was pressed against the window pane, sliding down slowly. This was the scratching noise I was hearing. While my initial reaction was shock, I was not afraid in the least. As an adult right now, I cannot explain why I wasn't scared out of my mind to see a creature like this staring at me from outside, but I simply stared back. Its eyes were pure black as it continued its gaze. A smile began to form on its decayed-looking face. "Hello, child," it said in a low, raspy voice. "Hi?" I replied with an inflection of a question. Who are you? Why are you staring at me through my window?" I continued nervously. "I do not have a name, only a purpose." It answered while grinning wider. Its answer confused me, but I ignored my confusion and continued my question to whatever this thing was. "Why are you here?" I asked. "To fulfill that purpose. I don't mean to frighten you, child. I mean you no harm. I was just curious." He replied in a way as to not fully answer my question. "How can I hear you through the glass? What are you?" I asked as I lifted myself off my bed. "I don't know what I am, just what I am meant to do," it said while tilting its head to the side. "You're the first of your kind to see me. This intrigues me," it continued. I walked towards my window, noticing the ragged clothing hanging from parts of its thin body. "Are you floating?" I quickly asked as I looked down to the ground from my window. It smiled and let out a small laugh. It was seemingly amused by my interest and my childish wonder. "I like you," it said while continuing to grin at me. More and more questions popped in my head. As I opened my mouth to ask another, it put its shriveled hand up to stop me. "I must go now, young one. I have much to do, but may I have your permission to visit you again?" it asked while slowly hovering away. "Yeah, please," I said excitedly. It didn't speak again and simply vanished around the corner of my house. I was transfixed while watching it float away. I didn't sleep a wink that night as my adrenaline and thoughts of what had just occurred made sure of that. Once morning arrived, I made my way down to the kitchen for a bowl of cereal. As I ate my breakfast at the kitchen table, I heard a siren in the distance. Finding nothing out of the ordinary, I continued while reading the kitty jokes in the back of the cereal box. The wailing from the siren became louder and louder. I jumped up in excitement as I realized it was passing through my neighborhood. I ran to the front room window and peered through the blinds. After a few seconds, I spotted the ambulance coming down the road. I smiled in delight. As a child my age, I don't get to see things like this too often. I wish I hadn't. My smile turned to a look of confusion as an ambulance pulled in front of my driveway. Stomping sounds were heard as my mother rushed down the stairs to run outside. I saw her frantically plead with the medics, pointing to our house. A terrible feeling went through me as I began to realize my father was still upstairs. I began to walk towards the stairs when the EMTs bursted through the door, making their way in. I watched in horror as they carried my father out on a stretcher. He passed away in his sleep of a heart attack. He wasn't discovered until the morning by my mother. That day, my mother and I spent the whole day together, crying. My father was gone. I slept in my mother's room that night, not wanting to be alone. The events of that day put my new friend out of my mind. The next day, my mother asked me to take the rest of the week off from school, which, as an 8-year-old, I had zero issues with. I decided to sleep in my own room from here on out. It wasn't long after I had fallen asleep. I heard a familiar scratching on my window. I came out of my grogginess slowly and looked towards the window. My friend was back with its palm flat against the window. "Oh, hello," I said while rubbing my eyes. "I came to visit you last night, but you were in your mother's room. Do you often do that?" it said, sounding as interested in me as I was in it. "No, I'm a big boy," I said with aggression. It tilted its head in confusion as I slowly looked towards the ground and began crying. My dad died last night. Neither of us wanted to be alone," I said slightly under my breath. It straightened its head up. If it had eyebrows, they would have been curled. "Does the death of another hurt you?" it inquired in a confused tone. "He was my father," I yelled back. I immediately covered my mouth, knowing my mother would have heard me. My sudden outburst startled my friend as it jolted back at my reaction. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to yell," I softly said after a few seconds of silence. "I believe I understand, child," it said, trying to offer its condolences. "All people must move on when it's their time. Yesterday was your father's time." I could tell his cold words were an attempt to comfort me. I slowly looked back up to it. "Move on to where?" I asked with tears welled in my eyes. I don't know where. That's not for me to know. There is a void in which all souls move to when they die, but I do not know what's on the other side, nor intend to know." It replied, trying to explain the best it could. "How do you know that?" I asked in a confrontational tone. "Because, young one, it is my job to bring them there," it said in a more confident tone. I raised my eyebrow in confusion as I looked into its black eyes. My dozens upon dozens of questions from the previous night had narrowed down to one. "Did you take my father there the other night?" I asked. Several seconds went by as it pondered its reply. "Yes," it stated simply. "That's why I was here. It was his time and I was here to collect him. I'm often curious about your kind, which is why I was looking into your room. I was not anticipating that you could see me though. None do." Can we be friends?" I said, holding back my tears. Its frame straightened up as if motivated by my words. "Yeah," it replied, while wearing that same skinny smile. We talked through most of the night. My friend and I were trying to get an understanding of each other's existence. I had never spoken to a human before, and it was equally as intrigued with me as I was with it. Monday morning I decided to go back to school, at the soonest I could. I made my way to the library. I wanted to see if there had been any recorded documents similar to what I was experiencing. I didn't know where to look, so I asked the librarian. Excuse me, do you have any books on..." I nervously looked away, suddenly embarrassed by my question. "People that take people's souls when they die?" "You mean like the Grim Reaper?" she said with an amused smile. I shrugged my shoulders in confusion. She led me to a section with several books involving this Grim Reaper. I skimmed through them all, trying to dig up any info I could. The pictures in the books of what the Grim Reaper looked nothing like my friend. This iteration was more of a skeleton clothed in robes, while my friend was certainly dead looking. It was not a skeleton. I checked out 3 of the books and made my way home. I anxiously awaited my friend's arrival to inform him of the research I'd done. I could almost set my watch by it as it arrived at the exact same time as the previous nights. I hastily ran to my window to show it what I found. "Are you the Grim Reaper?" I asked excitedly. After a look of confusion and a brief pause, it replied, "I do not know this Grim Reaper you mention. This is the first I've heard of such a thing, although it does appear your people know something of us." "Us?" I replied confused. It nodded its head. "There are many of us. I don't know how many, but just one of us could not possibly escort the amount of souls this realm produces." "Where did you come from?" I asked, now back to my confused state. "I don't know. I've always been here. I don't remember a time when I didn't exist." It replied, tilting its head once again. "Why do you take souls? Do you get paid?" I asked innocently. It let out a laugh, seemingly amused by my questions. I too laughed with a grin at my own question. Its laughter turned to silence as it put its head down as if to ponder my question. It slowly lifted its head to match its black eyes to mine. "I take souls because that's what I do. It's what I am. I cannot explain further than that," it stated in a far more firm tone. "Do you ever have that one thing in life that you wish you could forget?" I asked it a question that, to this day, I regret. The knowledge of what it gave me is terrifying, and the reason I've kept this a secret for so long. "Wait," I said in confusion. "I remember looking at my clock the night you took my father. It was around 10:30 p.m. My mom told me the doctor said my dad's heart attack started at around 11 p.m. You visited me first. I thought you only come for them after they die. Did you know he was about to die?" It stared at me, as if it wanted to tell me something but didn't know how. After a long, quiet pause, it replied, "Yes, I knew your father was going to die." It said it in a sad tone, as if it didn't want me to hear the words. Why didn't you warn me?" I asked with a glare. Another quiet pause filled the air. "Can you see the future? Do you know when I'm going to die?" I pleaded. No, child. I cannot see into the future. When it's someone's time, we have to end their time here. It answered begrudgingly. A shocking realization came over me. My eyes widened as I looked deeper into its black, cold eyes. Did you kill my father? I asked as I stared straight ahead. It stared at me for a brief moment of quietness. Yeah, that's how we extract them from their physical form. They must be killed when it's their time. It said, knowing his words would bring me pain. Why didn't you let him die first? I yelled in frustration as I began regretting naming this thing my friend. Young one, it pleaded with me. That's not how it works. My look of anger quickly morphed into a look of confusion. It continued. When left alone, humans are inherently immortal. They cannot die on their own. Their bodies will shrivel and weaken. They will only know pain and suffering as their own form betrays them. It is my job to free them of this and bring them to a new place, void of such suffering. I stared in disbelief as it described a reality I was not prepared for. My mouth hung open in shock at what I had just heard. Your kind suffer from diseases and viruses, but you will never succumb to the disease. You will never die from the virus. It's me. It's us that end it for you. When your body is at its breaking point, your father's heart attack would not have killed him, but his body would have never recovered. It was his time. It continued to explain as I plopped on the floor at the sudden realization. My friend, and I continued to remain friends through my adulthood. I lived my entire life with this knowledge, and it's been nothing less than torture. I don't blame my friend though. It did not know what kind of pain I would endure. The term, ignorance is bliss, couldn't have more meaning for me. I am writing this from my hospital bed. I can feel the cancer inside my body has reached the point of no return. It is soon also my time. I wonder, will my friend be here to meet me one last time? I'm the only person in this story, and this story makes me fearful to leave the house after sunset. So about a week ago I went out of my house to go for a late night bike ride down my road and back to my house to try and tire myself out so I could wake up for online classes the next morning. It was about 11:30 p.m. Eastern, and my dad had just gotten home, and I told him I wanted to go for a late night bike ride to tire myself out. He nodded and told me, "Go ahead, just put this headlight on and take the flashlight with you. And don't forget your phone just in case something happens." I walked out of the house and turned the porch light on so I could get my bike and so I could see the entrance to the driveway when I come back. I unlocked my bike and headed down the driveway onto the bumpy tar and gravel road that I live on. The way I go down is heavily wooded on both sides of me. That's also part of a state forest, so it had quite a bit of animals in it. I rode down the road with my headlamp on and my flashlight in my right hand illuminating the road in front of me, allowing me to see about 15 feet in front of me. After 6 minutes into my bike ride, I heard rustling and bustling of leaves and branches coming towards me, and I saw an 8-point buck jump out in front of me. I slammed on the brakes and nearly flipped the entire bike over. The deer never stopped. It just kept hauling ass into the woods across the street. That kind of surprised me since normally the deer would stop and stare into the lights, like the phrase, like a deer in the headlight. Well, that didn't happen, and it kind of creeped me out. So I kept going as I heard more deer come flying out of the woods behind me, where I had stopped with the first deer. Something had the deer spooked, and me spooked as well. Fearing whatever had scared the deer would come for me next, I, being the scared idiot I am, turned off the flashlight in my hand and put it in my pocket. This cut the distance I could see to about 10 feet, and it was a dim light, not the brightest. It could have been probably because of the batteries. This made my heart jump out of my chest as I saw something step out in front of me and stand right in front of me as I slammed on the brakes and stared at this thing. As soon as I looked up, I knew exactly what this thing was. It was the thing that I saw at my buddy Jason's house about a month ago, and here it was looking me dead in the eye from no more than 3 feet away. Back at Jason's, I could really get a good look at it, but now I could have reached out and touched it. It stared at me as I saw its white eyes stare into my soul, a feeling of sorrow and loss filling my mind and emotions. I looked at its body for only a moment more, seeing its chest looking almost like a buff person's chest, its abs toned and flat like a door, and its pecs flat as well. Its entire form was black, just like the night. Maybe that's why it blended in so well with the darkness of the night. I decided I needed to go, and I turned around and hauled ass the opposite direction, and I saw the house before I heard the pitter-patter of running feet behind me, and as soon as I saw the light on the porch, it all went black, as I felt myself lifted off my bike and thrown into what felt like a riverbed. I sat up and reached for the flashlight in my pocket and shined it around. I was in a riverbed, and I could see my house from the riverbed, its green light shining bright, awaiting my arrival home. But what threw me for a doozy was the fact there wasn't a river near my house, or any sort of waterway. I stood up and looked around, shining my flashlight, and I saw it again standing down the riverbed 15 feet away from me, as I saw a devilish smile appear on its face. I took off running in the direction of the light. I got to what looked like a slope upwards as I saw the walls of the riverbed start to rise now. I didn't know if this was a mind game going on in my head, but I was going to figure out. I grabbed my phone and looked at the time, and the entire phone screen just had a picture of fire and flames and a black gate opening. There was no time, no date, no battery, no nothing, just the picture on my screen. I said a prayer to try and protect myself, and I saw those two albino color creatures rush down the riverbed towards me. I grabbed the cross I now wear around my neck and prayed again as the creatures stopped in their tracks. I could see their faces. They looked like dog heads, almost like albino hellhounds. Blood dropped from their mouths as they stared at me with their mouths wide open, their sharp teeth wanting a chance to get a bite at me, and their raspy growl coming from their mouths. I felt my light go out, and I was surrounded by pitch blackness again, my entire body fearing that I was never going to see my family again. But at that moment, something grabbed me by the back of the collar and yanked me up away from the riverbed. It felt like I woke up as I looked around and saw what looked like a heavenly being lifting me up and carrying me away from the hellish riverbed below. I looked around and all I saw was bright light in front of me as I felt the heavenly being drop me back down to the world below. As I hit the ground, my body snapped up as I saw the road in front of me with a car with its headlights on, calling into the woods asking if anybody was there. I stood up and felt my pockets, and in my right hand was my phone, and in my left was the flashlight, and on my head was my headlight. I stood up and groaned as I turned on the headlamp. "Here," I said. As I walked towards them, my head pounding and my heart beating like a bass drum. I looked at my bike, and my bike was standing straight up like somebody was on it, and it creeped me out. I asked them if they could just drive me back to my house and drop me off at the end of the driveway. They did, and I thanked them, and they wished me good health and prayed for me. I walked back to my house with my back sore and my body feeling like I had just been hit by a train. I walked inside, and my parents rushed and hugged me, and were nearly crying asking where I had been at, and what had happened, and was I alright. I looked at them and asked, how long was I gone for? They both looked at each other, and then looked at the clock. The clock read 1:30 a.m., meaning I had been out for 2 hours. I pulled out my phone and looked at the screen, and sure enough my phone was back to the way it should be. I looked at my parents and hugged them, and walked upstairs to take another shower, since I was dirty from apparently landing in the woods. I took my shower, then I got dressed and laid in bed, and pulled out my phone and felt something on the back of the case. I flipped it around, and there on the back of the case read something that still chills my entire body and soul to the core. "See you soon, Jay." I froze and sat up and stared at my phone case. This type of thing just wasn't natural, and it's been in my pocket the whole time since I left and came back. And then all these notifications came piling into my phone. 15 missed calls from mom, 15 missed calls from dad, a call from a few friends, and just text messages galore. I put the phone down and stared into the dark of my room, the only light coming from my fish tank, and in my closet sat 2 white eyes on one side, and in the other side of the closet was 2 sets of orange eyes. I froze in place as they walked to the end of my bed and stared at me. I heard something in my head, but not something aloud, almost like they were talking to me inside my head. "Goodbye, old friend. I'll be waiting for you on the other side," it said, as it then gave a deep, bellowing roar in my head, as it and the other 2 sets of eyes vanished in thin air and disappeared from my room. I couldn't sleep that night, as I kept thinking about what the hell that thing was talking about, and why am I its human target? Seeing what was written on my phone case and seeing and hearing it speak shook my body and froze my soul and put the fear of God in me. I said a quick prayer and then tried to sleep. I heard a whisper from outside my dream realm and interrupted my sleep as I woke up, and I heard the whispering more. I panicked and chanted an incantation to try and rid the house and rid myself of the demons and whatever else was in my house. My soul and mind hadn't been the same since this encounter occurred, not even a week ago. These things that are coming for me might be coming for me again, or who knows, it might pick its next victim to torture. But let me give you one piece of advice if you want to mess with these things. Stay away and don't get close. And if you do, try not to look at them, or you may end up not knowing where you are, like I did. Good luck. And just another thing, don't disturb the unknown because maybe it's supposed to stay unknown.